In 2005, the Hollywood film The Exorcism of Emily Rose terrified audiences by claiming it was based on a true story. And it was. It was based on Anneliese Michel, a teenager in West Germany, whose real life was far more disturbing than any horror movie. What started as fainting spells quickly spiraled. Anneliese began hallucinating voices, telling her she was cursed. She dropped to her knees so violently and repeatedly that her ligaments tore. Soon, she was hiding under tables, barking like a dog for days on end, and eating spiders, coal, and even birds. Her parents, desperate for answers, turned to the church. The resulting diagnosis was spiritual. Anneliese was supposedly possessed by 6 distinct demons. But these weren't ancient, nameless entities. One of the voices speaking through her claimed to be the German dictator Adolf Hitler. The other alleged inhabitants of her body were equally specific. She manifested the persona of Judas, the biblical figure Cain, the fallen angel Lucifer, a disgraced Catholic priest from the 1500s, and the Roman Emperor Nero. If a demonic invasion is a universal threat, why would a teenage girl in 1970s West Germany specifically channel a roster of highly recognizable, culturally relevant European figures instead of generic monsters? Fast forward to a decade ago, and a strangely parallel mystery unfolded. An American man named Michael Boatwright was found entirely unresponsive in his hotel room. When he finally regained consciousness in the hospital, his American identity was completely gone. He introduced himself as Johann Eck, and despite his official identification documents, he was suddenly communicating in fluent Swedish. Instead of supernatural invasions, there is a biological reality hidden inside the human skull. A brain can completely fracture its own identity, creating symptoms so sudden and terrifying that for centuries we've blamed them on ghosts. Years after the tragic end of Anneliese's exorcisms, medical experts reviewed the clinical facts of her life. They concluded that she was never possessed. She was suffering from an untreated collision of 3 distinct mental illnesses. The first was temporal lobe epilepsy. This is a neurological condition where electrical misfires in a specific part of the brain trigger violent physical seizures. In severe cases like Anneliese's, these misfires also produce extremely vivid, terrifying auditory and visual hallucinations. The second was anorexia nervosa. This is a devastating psychological condition causing severe body dysmorphia. She starved herself until her body weight plummeted to a lethal 32 kilograms. The final piece of the diagnosis was hyper-religious personality disorder. Growing up in a strictly religious household, Anneliese's environment shaped her daily thoughts around whether every action was a sin. Her hallucinations preyed directly on the vocabulary she already possessed. Because she was raised terrified of Lucifer, Judas, and Hitler, those were the voices her broken mind manufactured. Had she grown up in a different culture, her hallucinations would have simply worn different faces. Today, clinical psychology has a specific diagnosis for a single mind containing multiple people: dissociative identity disorder, or DID. Consider the modern case of Kim Noble, a woman living with over 100 distinct personalities. In the architecture of DID, there is a primary personality known as the host, which branches out into separate identities called alters. These alters have vastly different names, ages, temperaments, and even separate memories from the host. When an alter takes control, the host experiences dissociative amnesia. Kim will suffer a blackout, waking up hours later with no memory of ordering a pizza, or finding herself mysteriously driving a car miles from home. She loses time. The brain functions as a series of isolated compartments with internal firewalls that lock different identities and memories away from the primary host. What triggers a human brain to shatter its own identity into multiple pieces? When medical data from across North America and Europe was compiled, researchers found that approximately 90% of recorded DID cases stem from severe repetitive trauma or abuse suffered during childhood. Dissociation is a biological defense mechanism. When a child experiences unbearable physical or emotional pain, the brain fractures its consciousness, absorbing the blow by creating a new identity to endure the suffering so the core self doesn't have to. Mild dissociation is a highly common feature of human biology. Studies show that up to 74% of the population has experienced it, whether it's feeling detached from your own body during a traumatic event or simply zoning out and losing time while driving on an empty highway. Dissociative identity disorder represents this survival mechanism pushed to its limit. The demons manifesting in these cases are internal creations, psychological reflections of a brain struggling to process its own environment or injury. When a mind breaks, how we choose to interpret that break dictates whether the person lives or dies. We have two widely contrasting approaches: the supernatural ritual of exorcism or the clinical process of modern psychotherapy. Because Annalise's community chose exorcism, she endured 67 grueling rituals over the span of 10 months. Her actual medical conditions went completely untreated, and she died a horrific, preventable death from starvation. Kim Noble survived because she was treated with specialized clinical therapy. By learning to identify the specific triggers that forced her alters to the surface, she was able to establish communication between her fragmented identities and begin the slow process of reintegrating her mind. Diagnosing severe trauma as demonic possession turns a treatable psychological condition into a fatal, self-fulfilling prophecy. Popular media continually exploits this illness. From classic horror films like Psycho to modern thrillers like Split, Hollywood routinely portrays DID patients as unpredictable, violent monsters, or uses their fractured minds as comedic punchlines. Statistical data proves the opposite is true. People living with dissociative identity disorder are overwhelmingly the victims of violence and abuse, not the perpetrators. Exorcisms don't cure demons, they punish traumatized minds. True healing only begins when we stop projecting our supernatural fears onto the vulnerable and abandon superstition for science.